Okay, so what we want to do is we want to follow the flow of food, right? So any food. It could be a protein, it could be a fat, it could be a carb. So I'm just going to say a food. From outside the body, through the digestive system, to the circulatory system, and eventually making it to your muscle cell. That is the goal. Can you do that? If you can explain how that happens, then you understand the systems. By the same token, you should also be able to show me how oxygen comes into the respiratory system, then through the circulatory system, and gets to a muscle cell. This one's a little bit more complicated because then I would also want to know how it leaves the muscle cell. Your CO2 goes through the circulatory system to the respiratory system, and you then exhale, right? So that has a little bit more complexity if I follow the entire route. You have to be very careful and listen to what the question is asking, okay? In the muscle cell, after it's used the energy, there are some energetic wastes, but that is more grade 12, what we talk about, the breakdown of proteins and so on, okay? So I'm going to diagram this process. You'll notice that I've come back to this original sketch here that I worked you through when I was doing digestion. It seems to make sense to me that I would go back to where I started. So as you recall, we have food that is coming into our body. And I'll take any typical food item that might be. So I'm going to take like a fatty burger, maybe pizza. Pizza's good because it has a whole bunch of different things inside of it. So in comes your food, and it comes into the digestive system where you mechanically digest it with your teeth, and your saliva chemically digests it, and it gets pushed down the esophagus into the stomach. Okay? And then from the stomach, it gets reacted with this, if you recall, pepsin, which is a protease, and it'll start the protein breakdown. It'll break down the proteins into polypeptides. So our carbs are broken down by the amylase, and the proteins broken by the pepsin. And so now this chyme, this acidic chyme, gets pushed from the stomach into the small intestine. And inside the small intestine, we have the release of pancreatic juices. Your pancreatic juices are going to include a whole bunch of enzymes. And these enzymes are responsible for the major digestion of food. If you don't recall, these enzymes include pancreatic proteases, pancreatic amylase, pancreatic nuclease, and pancreatic lipase. Each of these are responsible for breaking down a different type of macromolecule. The fat digestion is a little bit more complicated, and I'm not going to go over that here again because I want to focus on circulation. So once all these things are broken down in the duodenum, then it moves along the small intestine until we get to the jejunum. And in the jejunum, we have these folds, and on these folds, we have villi, and on the villi, we have microvilli. And all this serves to increase the surface area. And at this point, these broken down monomers now, right, your amino acids, your nucleotides, and your glucose units, in most cases, they get absorbed into the blood circulatory system, and off they go. And at that point, I finished with digestion. I didn't really talk about what happens next. So now that I'm done doing circulation, I'm going to connect that whole story together and bring it back. This lesson was more complicated because I also talked about fat digestion, and as you might recall, it involved a few additional steps. Okay, so that was digestion, and now I'm going to connect it to circulation because at this point we've not made it to the muscle cell. All right, so let us move on. All right, so once again, I'll start with the mouth. Right. And it goes into the pharynx, which is that common cavity at the back of the throat. So your mouth and your nose, these both connect together into the pharynx, that common area at the back of our throat. And at the back of the throat, we have the trachea at the front. And we have the esophagus. Right? And so your esophagus carries the food to your stomach. So now the food is in your stomach. The bolus is in your mouth, oral cavity, pharynx, esophagus, and then it mixes with the gastric juices, and it's now acidic chyme. And that goes into the small intestine, and small intestine then does its thing with all those folds that we have, right? So if I were to take this very specific section of the small intestine and blow it up like I had over here, right? So I'm going to take this section here, I'm going to go in the small intestine, and I'm going to go to the level of the villi, right? So now I'm going to zoom in. Zoom in here, all right? And so this will allow me to see the villi. So it's a big zoom. And inside the villi, we have these blood vessels, right? We have these blood vessels coming in. And we have other blood vessels going out. And in the middle here, we have that lacteal. I'm not going to draw the lacteal because it's just going to get, I will draw it just so you can at least see it and make the connection. All right, so here's our lacteal. All right, so this blood vessel is where the nutrients go in. And these nutrients are then carried to the liver. The liver is responsible for detoxifying all the food. So all this blood leaves the small intestine and it goes along the circuit called the hepatic portal system. Whenever you see the word hepatic, you know that deals with the liver. So this goes off to the liver. If I was really artistic, I would have drawn a liver properly, but I just drew a circle. So that's your liver. So liver is responsible for all the blood goes in there. It takes out, if you drink alcohol and there's other, chemicals or whatever things that come in your body, it'll go to the liver. The liver determines what is supposed to be there, what's not, and it tries to get rid of things that don't belong there. If you drink a lot of alcohol, for example, your liver tries to detoxify it because it is a poison, and it does a pretty good job. But if you overdo it, then your liver can't keep up, and you end up killing your liver cells. You end up hardening it. It's called liver cirrhosis. Anyway, moving on. So liver, it in turn is now going to deliver blood to the circulatory system. So what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to jump over to respiration. I'm going to make a connection here in just a moment. And I'm going to do the circulatory connection here. So your heart. Really, I should do it in red, right? But I'm going to do it in black. I'm going to use red to represent oxygenated blood vessels and blue to represent deoxygenated blood vessels. I'm going to draw my heart in a Valentine's heart shape. But this is a misconception. The heart does not look like this. This is just the easiest way for me to draw it. You'll also notice I'm drawing the top of the heart tiny and the bottom of the heart big. The top of the heart is known as the atria, and the bottom of the heart is known as the ventricle. Now, when you're looking and identifying any part of the body is facing you. So when you identify left and right, you identify it based on the whatever's facing you, not your own self looking at it. So this is your left atrium. This is the left ventricle. This is the right atrium, and this is the right ventricle. Okay. Now, the atrium feeds to the ventricle all the time. So blood always flows in one direction as well. So to make sure blood flows in one direction, we have these special structures known as valves. So these valves ensure blood flows one way. So I'm going to take this oxygenated blood and I'm going to start right here in the left atrium. This blood will be pushed from the left atrium thanks to the muscle contraction of the heart. So as you go through the PowerPoint and click on some of the links, you're going to see this very special electrical spot in the heart, the SA node, and it sends electricity through the heart and causes the whole heart to contract. And the heart doesn't contract at once; it contracts in parts. And so there's a video in there. There's a great analogy explaining the importance of the timing of the contraction to push the blood and get it to go where you want it to go. So the whole heart doesn't contract at once; different parts contract at different times. The atria will contract and push the blood from the left atrium into the left ventricle. So now the blood's sitting in the left ventricle. It cannot go back in the left atrium because the valve will not let it go back. Once the blood gets pushed, the valve closes and it stops. Then the ventricle will contract. So the atria contracts first, pushing the blood down into the ventricle. Then the ventricle will contract and it will push the blood into the aorta. Now the way I'm drawing is a major misconception. I'm drawing the aorta attached to the left ventricle, which is true. But if you look at an actual model of the heart, which you'll see in the simulation videos, you'll see the aorta it's attached to the top of the ventricle. So the blood gets pushed into the ventricle, and then the bottom of the heart contracts and it pushes the blood back up. But it won't go into the atria because the valve won't let it. But there's another valve here, the aortic valve, that will allow the blood to flow out of the ventricle into the aorta. So the aorta actually comes out the top of the heart. Okay, but for this diagram to explain how blood flows, I'm just going to put it out the side here. And then there is a valve right here that's going to control the flow of blood out. Okay, so this giant artery is known as the aorta. It is the largest artery of your body. It's under enormous pressure. Imagine putting a hose attached to your home. And where is it going to be under the most pressure? Where it's attached to your home, or at the other end where it comes out of the hose? Think of attaching a hose to a fire hydrant. If you attached a regular home hose to a fire hydrant, the hose would blow up. The only way you can stop that from happening is by reinforcing the hose. So that reinforcement, that really thick wall, is also what we expect to see in the aorta. The aorta and arteries are thick. They're reinforced. The aorta will then branch out into smaller, but they're big blood vessels, into smaller blood vessels. And these blood vessels that it branches out into, they're known as arteries. Okay, so these are big blood vessels known as arteries. And these arteries have different names depending on what part of the body they go to. So you got the femoral artery, you have the subclavian artery, and so on. Carotid artery to the brain. And then these blood vessels here, these arteries, they'll break out and branch out into smaller blood vessels, much smaller. And these smaller blood vessels that are carrying oxygenated blood from the heart to the system, these are known as arterioles. So still that same root word. And then finally, these arterioles, they'll break out into very tiny blood vessels, and these blood vessels are a single cell thick. And they're known as capillaries. So capillaries are defined by the fact that they are single cell thick. And so the cells, the red blood cells, when they go through here, they're only a single cell thick. And so these reach the organ. So it could be a muscle, it could be the heart, it could be a kidney, it could be the brain, whatever. And you'll see lots of capillaries coming in here. And at this point, the oxygen is then released into the tissue, into the cells. And then the cells will undergo metabolism, and they'll release carbon dioxide back into the capillaries. So this area where the capillaries are, we call that the capillary bed. So there's a whole bunch of capillaries in there, capillary bed. And then these capillaries, which are now deoxygenated, they're going to return, and a bunch of them will come together from various places, and they'll make up this tiny blood vessel. I can draw them. It's not very good drawing. Known as a venule. So this has deoxygenated blood. And you'll recall this from the respiratory lesson. And then these venules, several of these will meet up together, coming from different locations. And they'll create larger blood vessels known as veins. And finally, these veins will come together. There's two major areas where they'll come together. They'll come together either from the bottom below the heart or from above the heart. So there's this giant vein And this giant vein will be fed all the veins from the bottom of the body, from all over the place. And so this giant vein is known as the vena cava. If it's coming from the bottom, it's known as the inferior. If it's coming from the top, it's known as the superior. And then that feeds back into the heart. Right? Specifically, it feeds into the right atrium. So the right atrium has deoxygenated blood. And so that deoxygenated blood is in the right atrium. So let's just kind of go back. The aorta, really thick, it's under a lot of pressure. The arteries still have a lot of pressure. The arterioles, there's still some pressure. The capillaries, very little pressure. And then once you get to these venules and veins and vena cava, the pressure is extremely low, right? Now, if you're coming from below the heart, especially the legs, the heart, when it squeezes, it puts a lot of pressure on your blood and it forces it through your body. And when it relaxes, your blood is under very little pressure. So when you're anywhere close to your heart, in your abdominal area, the relaxation is not a big deal. But if you're in your legs and your heart relaxes, all your blood could just fall right back down to your feet. We don't want that. So in your legs, we have a very special pump down here. Okay, that's a terrible leg. And in here, we have these valves that are in your legs. And these valves, they prevent the blood from falling back down. So when your heart squeezes, a systolic contraction, a systolic pressure, it squeezes, it pushes the blood up the veins, and then when it relaxes, the blood falls back, but it only falls back to the level of these valves. And whenever you walk, every time you walk, you have, your muscles of your legs will squeeze the veins. And so you have a thing called a skeletal muscle pump. Skeletal muscle pump that works in your legs. The actions of your muscles will pump the blood, will help assist the blood to be pushed back up towards the heart. So if you ever drive to Florida, my family lives in Florida, and you do a really long drive, if you notice, especially your parents, if they drive for a long period of time, their feet will become all swollen because the skeletal muscle pump's not working. They're sitting there, and the blood will kind of pool in the feet and cause it to swell. Right? Anyway, so the aorta is very thick, the veins are not. So when you look at the PowerPoint, you'll see that. So here we are, the blood is sitting here in the right atrium. And so when the heart contracts, it pushes blood into the right ventricle. So when the heart contracts, it goes from the atria, left or right, into the ventricle, left or right. Notice how the left and right are separated by this, right? This is known as a septum. And it keeps the oxygenated blood on the left separate from the deoxygenated blood on the right. Now when we say deoxygenated, there's still oxygen in it, just not as much as on the left-hand side. So now the next task is to get this blood oxygenated. So we need to send it somewhere. So where do we send it? We send it to the, you fill in the blank? If you said lungs, you are correct. Now, for most of us, if I say arteries carry oxygenated blood, that's true 99% of the time. There are two examples where this doesn't happen. Here's one of them. Here's an artery that's going to leave the right ventricle, and it's carrying deoxygenated blood. And it's going to head all the way up here to your lungs. Oopsies. To your lungs. Okay, so this blood vessel goes to your lungs, and this blood vessel is known as the pulmonary artery. So arteries are defined by the fact that they carry blood away from the heart. And this is one of two blood vessel arteries that carries deoxygenated blood. And then when we get to the lungs, we learned about this in respiration. It goes to the alveoli, there's diffusion, you have external respiration, and then the blood vessel has oxygen. And this is called the pulmonary vein, which is one of two veins that carries oxygenated blood. And this will return back to the heart. And what place do we have left? The left atrium. And that completes the cycle. So that is how blood cycles through the circulatory system For the left atria, to the left ventricle, to the aorta, which is super thick, it's under a lot of pressure, the arteries, which are thick, under pressure, arterioles, capillaries, to the organ, and that could be any organ, including the heart. The heart also needs blood. It doesn't get the blood from inside of it. It has to be supplied from outside as well through the coronary arteries. If the coronary arteries get blocked, you end up with a myocardial infarction or heart attack or something like that. And then once it leaves the organ with carbon dioxide and very little oxygen, venule, vein, vena cava, back to the heart, then to the pulmonary branch. So when I start labeling these, this is the pulmonary branch up here. Pulmonary circulation is heart to lung, and systemic is heart to body. And coronary feeds the heart itself. And the brain has its own particular circulation, and hepatic is the liver, and so on. So that's the circulatory system. So at this point, you should be able to tell me how oxygen makes it from the outside to the muscles. From the outside, down the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchial tubes, the alveoli, pulmonary vein, into the heart, aorta, arteries, arterial, and then the organ would be the muscle. Food is a little bit more complicated though. So as you recall, I was talking about how the food was absorbed by the villi, and it was, absorbed into the blood vessels. And then that went to the hepatic portal system, which went to the liver. The liver is an organ, just like we have down here. So that means there's going to be a hepatic vein that's going to leave the liver and the food rich or nutrient rich blood is now going to enter the circulation, and it'll come back to the heart, circle through, pick up some oxygen, cycle back to the heart and back to the body, and then by the time it makes it to the muscle cell, these organs, it'll have both oxygen and it'll have nutrients. It'll have nutrients as well. It'll have both. Both of them are there. And that's the process. That is how we connect the digestive system to the circulatory system to the muscles, and the respiratory system to the circulatory system to the muscles. This, if you understand this, if you can reproduce something like this without, constantly going back and forth, pausing and looking at this video or other resources, then you understand the systems. This is a superficial, straight content knowledge along with an explanation, because there's a lot of details, and I mentioned a few things in passing, which hopefully you'll make a connection to in the PowerPoint. Things that you'll see in the PowerPoint that I did not talk about in detail include the electrical activity of the heart. The electrical activity of the heart, which you measure using an ECG, will show you that the heart is functioning properly. So make sure you take a look at that in the PowerPoint as well. Okay? So if you have any questions, make sure you ask. I'm here for you. And otherwise, your primary focus is the culminating task. Secondary focus is the worksheet and getting as complete an understanding as you can get with the circulatory system, which is really an accessory to all the other systems that we've talked about in grade 11. And in grade 12, the circulatory system is incredibly important when we start talking about thermoregulation, osmoregulation, endocrine function, nervous function, and immune system.